This video is about rock and roll. And rock and roll is such an undeniable force in pop culture around the world that I don't really have to tell you how it sounds, how it feels. It's loud, it's American, it came out of the blues, it has vocals, guitar, bass guitar, and drums. It's also worth noting that the vast majority of you guys watching this video will never have lived in a world without the cultural presence of rock. It's just so everywhere, it's ubiquitous. And rock and roll is beginning to show its age. It's been around for nearly 80 years to be precise, and in that time it's grown into a truly massive genre, with a diverse legion of subgenres, eras, and scenes to explore. That represents a lot of different sounds. But that's only how things are today. These days, rock means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But in 1965, rock meant a lot fewer things. Its definition was significantly more narrow. That was a time before rock would experience what I consider to be its most significant internal revolution. A fracture that's at the core of what rock and roll really means today. There have been several battles for the soul of rock and roll. So think about grunge supplanting 80s glam metal. Clearly there's a big difference in musical characteristics, but there's also a difference in the approach to the question, what should rock and roll ideally be? Now, if you're flipping through your mental Rolodex of major riffs in rock and roll, you're probably able to name a few of them, even if rock and roll isn't your favorite genre. If you go far enough back, you might be thinking of like Boogie Woogie and Skiffle, or the British Invasion and surf rock, kind of mods and greasers for punk versus anything. Now, don't get me wrong, these are all really important schisms in the history of rock and roll, but what I'm about to explain is significantly less talked about, and it's had a massive impact on rock and roll, and I would argue the entire canon of Western music from that point on. Obviously, you can't retroactively change music that's already been written. This is the genre that would become known as progressive rock. Now, I know you're probably a bit let down by that, progressive rock, but I promise you that learning what progressive rock actually means and the genre's initial musical goals, it'll massively improve your understanding of how we listen to music, how we categorize the music that we listen to, and even how we enjoy music on the most fundamental level. But also exploring prog rock really shows you how frequently incorrect our theories are of how we got to now. But in order to unpack this story, we really need to bravely look at a head-crackingly annoying question. And that question is, what the hell is a genre anyway? And I know that sounds a bit silly. We all know what musical genres are, right? Pop, rock, hip-hop, etc. But let's indulge in a little bit of over-analysis. What is a genre at its core? Is it defined by musical characteristics? Like if it has a dance beat, falsetto vocals, and lyrical themes about generally having a great time, it must be disco. Or is genre instead what listeners perceive to be part of a given style? This would be like a socially constructed theory of genre. For example, most people see the band Green Day as punk, but some punk heads would disagree. But it's too bad the majority are in agreement, so it gets sorted as punk at your local record store. And to be honest, while sometimes useful, neither of these are very clean ways to define genre. So I'll be using the term in its taxonomical sense, as a tool to group reasonable concentrations of music together for us. Prog is one such concentration, and if you look at what holds it together as a genre, it's often its opposition to everything that rock and roll was at the time of its formation. So just like most musical genres, prog rock doesn't really have a birthday. If you ask 10 different music nerds, you'll probably get 10 different answers. It was Pet Sounds, it was George Martin and the Beatles, it was a Neanderthal performing the first 8-minute prog rock flute solo. So just consider this David's rundown of the history of prog rock. I promise I won't get bogged down in unnecessary backstory, so let's, and this is a promise, keep this brief. The universe as we understand it today began as an infinitely hot and infinitely dense point. Later in the 1960s, prog evolved out of rock and roll bands that were experimenting and expanding the borders of their genre. An idea that rock doesn't have to be party music or easy to dance to, its lyrics don't have to be about adolescent heartbreak.
It can be about 14th century English literature. It can feature a Baroque-themed jazz solo. An album opener can be 18 minutes long. You can create a rock and roll song that features church organ or bagpipes or an entire symphony.
And while initially this genre that would become known as prog rock was kind of inseparable from the psychedelic movement of the late 1960s, it would outlast the psychedelic golden age. And while prog rock would always kind of have one foot in the psychedelic pool, it became its own thing. It became a very clearly distinct genre from psychedelic rock. And the level of kind of avant-garde experimentation that you see, it really differs between groups, especially as you get into the mid and late 70s. Bands like Genesis and Pink Floyd would blend prog and traditional rock tropes very successfully. And I love those bands, great stuff, but it is kind of the tip of the prog iceberg. And the deeper you go, the stranger things get, but also the more conflict we see. The Civil War part of this title is a metaphor, but it's not that hyperbolic. Progressive rock was intentionally disrupting the rock and roll status quo, and there were some serious haters among the rock and roll establishment. Enter the Canterbury scene and the rock in opposition movement, also known as Rio. These two scenes in the mid-70s, especially in the UK, became the new underground for progressive music, with the rock in opposition movement being its most militant arm, so to speak. Rio bands like Henry Cow out of the UK or Universe Zero from Belgium were continuing the project of progressive rock. These bands were really into the progress idea of progressive rock, that it should be always changing, always progressing. And this is in the face of new popular budding genres like disco and punk rock. And it's worth taking a moment to specifically focus on punk rock. And this is not a which genre is better kind of thing. I'm a huge fan of both. But these two rock and roll subgenres, for at least a moment, were in direct conflict.
And punk music, with its cynical, deconstructing ethos, championed musical simplicity and emotional intensity. Many punks saw prog rock as pompous, self-indulgent, and hypocritical. And, of course, boring. English rocker Robert Palmer famously claimed that punk had saved rock and roll from its big, bad, bloated self. And this is not an unpopular opinion to this day. It's echoed by posters on music forums and social content aggregators like Reddit. But to be fair, while there certainly was some animosity amongst fans, this wasn't usually true of the people actually making the music. A somewhat relevant example is when John Lydon, better known for his Sex Pistols persona Johnny Rotten, wore a custom I Hate Pink Floyd t-shirt. This obviously ticked off Floyd fans and helped solidify the punk-prog beef in the annals of pop culture. The only problem is, that t-shirt was always intended as a tongue-in-cheek gesture. Because it's important to note, with the critical and popular success of Pink Floyd at the time, this was like saying you didn't like the film The Godfather. I mean, Lydon even addressed it himself. He said the whole I Hate Pink Floyd thing was hilarious. Anyone who took that seriously needs a new head. And as it happens, I love early Pink Floyd with Syd Barrett. The original Sid Vicious, by the way. And even some of the 70s stuff. I just hated the assumption that they were holier than God and you couldn't give them a knock. And Pink Floyd's David Gilmour knew this as well. He commented, "It frightened a lot of people, but it didn't frighten me," adding, "I like a good kick in the pants, it does you good." And when he was asked if he had any ill feelings, he responded, "No, I thought the Sex Pistols were rather good."
Today, with songs becoming shorter and shorter due to the so-called Spotify effect, coupled with the pop landscape becoming more diverse, but also more niche and more targeted, we're definitely in a unique spot in musical history where there are now things like, I hate to even say it, data-driven songwriting. And that puts rock and roll in a really strange place. It's no longer top dog by a long stretch. And full album listening doesn't always jive with our really anemic attention spans. And because of this, it can seem like prog rock left very little of an impact on our current musical reality. And this view, although understandable, is wrong. Prog's experimental verve was so extreme for the time that it really shifted the needle on what rock and roll artists and even pop artists were willing to do. Prog rock, I think, really showed record companies that strange, if packaged right, can sell. Radio play doesn't always equate to album sales, and that art genres can reach a mainstream audience. And prog didn't stop in the 70s. There are a bunch of more contemporary acts that continue that tradition. Or at least they're intentionally incorporating aspects of prog rock into their music. There are groups like the Mars Volta or King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, or on the more prog metal side, we get Dream Theater and Tool. But what makes these bands prog anyway? Why are they different from, say, a pop artist like Ed Sheeran? So here's where we come to another head-crackingly annoying question. What makes prog what it is? And in my videos, I usually like to just jump into the techniques and the technologies that help produce the genre's sound. With prog rock, however, we run into an interesting dilemma. And that is whether prog is more defined by its sound or its approach. There are critics and musicians that see prog as always changing, always moving. And since progress is a fluid process, prog rock should never be caught standing still, at least not long enough to take a snapshot of its internal musical logic. But to be completely transparent, I think that view is crazy idealistic. I see prog more as a bridge between traditional rock and roll and fully experimental kind of avant prog or art rock, which is what I think prog ultimately becomes if you bring its philosophy to completeness. As for the prog rock we find lumped together at the record store, there are of course common musical characteristics. If you listen to some of the recommendations I'll be sharing in just a moment, you'll definitely start to hear these commonalities. The first thing that you'll notice is that songs are longer than in pop or traditional rock and roll. There's a heavy use of poetic and sometimes even archaic language, with lots of medieval, fantasy, sci-fi, and psychedelic themes. Song structures are also less formulaic, routinely ignoring the verse-chorus that we're so familiar with. Like in jazz, songs can be split up into parts and solos, or like classical music, a song might introduce a musical theme and then explore variations on that melody. And time signatures, tempos, keys, none of these things are guaranteed to stay the same throughout a given song. And long stretches of purely instrumental music are really common. And as far as instruments go, there's a significant expansion of the rock and roll lineup. You might also hear a flute, violins, other woodwinds, folk instruments like mandolins and steel guitar are also popular. All sorts of keys are also common as well, with organ, piano, harpsichord, electric piano, and synthesizers. Let's not forget, this is also the era of the concept album, which is by no means the sole domain of prog rock. There are plenty of genres that use concept albums, but it's an idea that was extremely popular among prog rock groups in the 1970s. Also, due to the storage limitations of the 12-inch LP, your standard vinyl record, many bands started to release multi-disc albums. A double album, a triple album. Because you gotta remember, you can make your Spotify playlist as long as you want, but on a vinyl 12-inch LP, you have about 20 to 25 minutes of music per side. And remember how I was on about prog rock songs being uncommonly long? The progressive rock band Yes has an album called Closer to the Edge, where the first song takes up an entire first side of the album. It's an 18 or 19 minute long song, but the song is split into 4 movements, which is like really proggy too. But I think it's time to do some actual listening. Now, before we get to the recommendations, as always, these are just my picks. It's my list of albums that I think act as a really good on-ramp for anybody who wants to get started in the genre. The list that you would make might be different. You might add stuff that I wouldn't, or omit things that I would add. But also, we're listening to prog rock, so open your mind to the weird, the unusual, and the challenging. But without further ado, here we have it, 6 different prog rock albums by 6 different prog rock bands. And for our first recommendation, we have the classic pillar of progressive rock, In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. This album is an incredible creative achievement, and you're sure to notice some frequently used samples if you're a fan of hip-hop or vaporwave. Next up, we have Trick of the Tail by Genesis. Now, I'm sure I'll hear it from Peter Gabriel fans for this one. I am one of you. But this Phil Collins-led Genesis album still packs a fantastic progressive punch, and it's a great example of how prog would mingle with the mainstream, and the result of this mixture was usually pretty good.
On this one, check out the song Ripples. And coming up for number 3, we have Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull. This is just a really solid album from beginning to end, and it has enough playful flute melodies and Tolkien-esque folksiness to get you through the winter. It's a really cozy album, and it's also one of my personal favorites on this list. And next up, we have Emerson, Lake and Palmer by Emerson, Lake and Palmer. These guys are often seen as the quintessential prog rock band, and this is certainly one of, if not their best album. And although initially challenging for the uninitiated, all is rewarded with the prog folk ballad Lucky Man, which finishes off the record. Coming in at number 5, we have Henry Cow, Legend. This is a band that was part of the Rio, or Rock in Opposition movement. This is firmly in the world of avant prog, with big helpings of free jazz influence atonality. The odds are, just statistically, this won't be your thing, but on the off chance that you can listen to this, you may just be a drummer. I would dip your toes into the chaotic opening track, Nirvana for Mice, and just see how you feel. But if you've dabbled in drumming, the percussion on this track is just something else. And finally, we have Close to the Edge by Yes. This is currently my favorite prog album, at least for right now. If you've liked what you've heard so far, odds are you'll love this one. Personally, my favorite sonic moments on this album are the soaring vocals on the second track, and You and I. So check it out. So there we have it, 6 fantastic albums. I really hope you give them a listen. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving a like or a subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and I really do appreciate it. And please let me know if there's a genre that you'd want me to cover in a future video. This year, I'm trying to take this channel a little bit more seriously, so I'm trying to build out like a proper content calendar, so any recommendations that you have are actually really helpful. But that's all for now. Stay curious, keep listening, and I'll see you next time.